Hello, friends of .NET. It is Tuesday, I think. Yeah, it's Tuesday. And we have some items today. We're still in the red item zone here, which is fun, but we also have a lot of stuff that isn't red. So let's get started with this one here.
All right, so I guess I can speak to that. We actually reviewed this issue a couple of weeks ago. And if you recall, the scope of the original proposal was much more ambitious in that it was introducing new constructor overloads, and it was introducing a bunch of requires and reference code annotations. It turned out that trying to introduce a default type info resolver in JSON serializer options, accepting a default constructor, does create interesting side effects, especially when you're working with collection initializers. So just to clarify what I mean by this, if you have a list of configuration and your default constructor inserts one element into that collection, then if you do a collection initializer on that property that does curly brace A, B, C, then you will end up with something that has open curly brace, default value, A, B, C. So I guess as a general piece of advice, if you expect a list to be used as a collection initializer, don't pre-insert any elements into that. But that's me digressing, I guess. So we scrapped that original plan, and we're just falling back to a very basic proposal, which is we have a feature switch, and we have a static property on JSON serializer that is basically hydrated by that feature switch, and is also registered in the local ilink.substitutions file, which means that if you actually specify a feature switch at link time, then any branches for which that property does not hold will get trimmed away, which is something that the ASP.NET Core folks are eager to use. There's a change in the name of what we're proposing. So the full name for the feature switch would be system.text.json.json serializer.is reflection enabled by default, which fully reflects the name of the static property we would be exposing. One thing to note is that this full name diverges from an already shipped feature switch in .NET 7, which is under system.text.json.serialization in this case. Me and other Eric debated about this discrepancy, and we kind of decided that we're fine with that because we feel that the new naming kind of reflects better best practices with respect to use of feature switches. That's really all there is to this proposal.
So one question I have is, what would the else look like here?
So that's a completely fake example, to be perfectly honest. It's basically whatever code whatever code falls into that branch, whenever is reflection enabled by default is set to true, would get removed by the linker. And in the case of ASP.NET, for example, they would be creating a new instance of the default JSON type info resolver, which basically routes the entire reflection-based edifice that system.text.json is using. So maybe not the best example in this case, because that method is already honoring that feature flag. But the idea is that if the switch is explicitly disabled, then whatever is within that if statement would get trimmed away.
Would linking have an easier time processing this, and would users have an easier time understanding that it doesn't change if instead of a get only property, we made it a static read only field?
In my tests, it wouldn't seem to. I mean, the static property works as you would expect. I'm not sure how.
Well, it says
user
here that
perceptions-
it has to be registered in IL-link substitutions. If it was a static read-only field, then I think the linker would know that it can consider it to be a constant on.
So two things here.
Oh no,
One
because
is
IL-link substitutions is compile or build declaration.
Yeah.
Settings. Yeah, the JIT is what would care about static read-only. All right.
the other thing too is if it was a field, you'd have to declare a static constructor to set it based on the app context setting.
A field initializer could do it.
It's too complicated for a field initializer, from what I've seen. Like we've been using static read-only properties for these things.
Okay, that's what I was thinking. My biggest thing was I was seeing the comment about IL-link substitutions, and I conflated the JIT and the trimmer on who likes static read-only. The JIT will drop the field or drop the property into a field ref in tier 1, and it'll drop the field ref into a constant in pass 2.
Right.
As long as it understands no one can ever set it again. So yeah, seems fine.
So then we're cool with the proposal as is?
Are we happy with the name? So maybe the first, are we happy with the feature switch being like the same as the public API property?
I mean, that makes the most sense to me. Like, why would we not match it?
Right. Okay. I mean, the why we would not is because there's already one app context switch in system text JSON that's following a different naming pattern.
I mean,
It uses system.text.
Any app context switches that are introduced in .NET Framework start with switch dot, and most of the ones introduced in .NET Core don't start with switch dot. So this is one of those universes where our only consistency is our lack of consistency.
Okay. Like I do like this pattern of the feature switch, the app context switch name being the public API name. Like we did the same thing with dynamic code is supported.
Right.
And so I'm happy to like keep that as like a pattern going forward. Is like think of what name you'd use in the public API, use that for the feature switch name.
Yep.
So then my only concern is reflection enabled by default, which we went through a handful of them, but like we kind of settled on that's kind of the best name.
Yeah, I mean,
Or
Chad
the
is
fe- or the
asking whether
functionality.
we can remove the word by, but like that seems even worse. Is reflection enabled default? Like that does not. I think I understand what is reflection enabled by default means.
What do you think it means?
To me, it means that, you know, is it assumed to be there effectively, right? Like meaning in serialization, like does the serializer have a fallback to reflection, right? And then the answer is reflection by default is false, then I would assume you can't fall back to reflection, and so the linker can link everything out that had any sort of dependency on reflection in the JSON serializer.
I think you can at runtime opt it back in. Like I think that there's a gesture to relink it, but
So there is.
why would you do that?
If you explicitly use what's called the default JSON type info resolver.
Yeah, I mean, I guess really it would be a library could say this library is depending upon the reflection behavior, and if you're going to call it, I'm going to link it in, and I don't care what your trimmed app wants. It's the support needs to be there.
Right.
And for an application, you would just not turn the setting off.
Yeah.
If you use the default type info resolver, you'd still get warnings, right? Like because it actually will use reflection. So
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little wordy, but it's probably fine. The only thing that I would be worried about with the name is it gonna pop up in weird, like, is it gonna be a weird order or weird presence and things like IntelliSense? I don't know what the context of other nouns around it would be.
Well, it's just serialize and deserialize what has been exposed in that class.
Okay. It doesn't have other.
Is this? No.
Yeah. Because I guess really it'd be if it has other statics and it's like, you know, supports reflection by default, then we should call it. We should match that pattern so that they all stay together.
Yeah.
But if
No,
we've not added one.
I believe that's the only property
Yeah.
we're adding to that class.
Yeah, I do. Having said it, I do slightly feel like supports reflection by default would be more compact and sounds more like a property name, but I don't super.
Yeah, it wouldn't be accurate though, because like reflection is still, I mean, theoretically supported if you use the default resolver
enough.
explicitly.
I guess.
Yeah, I mean,
so supported
what
versus
this-
enabled is, yeah. So yeah, it's fine. Let's
What
stop
this
talking and
flag
ship it.
modulates is the behavior of the serializer if no resolver has been explicitly configured. So I guess we were trying to find a good name for that thing.
So fast forward 3 releases down the road, do we think we would make a breaking change and make that false by default?
I would think so, yes. It would break the kind of the hello world examples that most people associate with system.txt.json.
You wouldn't think so, or you would think so?
I think it would be a breaking change.
Oh,
Yeah.
I think we wouldn't do it. I don't think we'd ever do it.
Yeah.
You'd have to use the source generator is the thing. Like,
Sorry, I should rephrase my question. If I do file new project, right, console app, and I don't do any sort of trimming, then the current behavior makes sense to me, right? But if I enable trimming, I think it would be reasonable to say, like, at that point we toggle the default.
I think it done at 8, we could do that. Like in ASP.NET, for sure, when you enable AOT, when you say publish AOT,
Yeah.
we're gonna turn this off by default. Like,
Okay, we
we
are
will
doing this then by 8.
for ASP.NET, the plan is when you enable AOT in your app, we will disable this feature switch. Whichever way you think about it.
That makes
What's the
sense to me.
mechanism that controls that?
MS build.
It's
Like
the
MS build, there'll be MS build logic that says, I see published AOT is true, and you haven't set the JSON serializer reflection enabled by default. So I'm going to set reflection enabled by default to false.
Okay,
And then if
so
you want to
just
override it, you just set it to false.
Is that
somewhere in
basically-
the SDK, it's linking that TFM and the publish trim setting together to go inject more like app context or IL link substitution settings.
So it's basically default substitutions. Is that the way to think about it? Or is that specific to this one feature here?
We do that for a lot of feature switches. Is if you, so for example, one thing is if you publish AOT in 7, event source gets disabled because it didn't really work in 7.
Okay, that I think is a good thing to add here. So we are probably setting this to false when AOT is enabled.
Is it when AOT is enabled or when AOT is enabled and your TFM says your ASP.NET Core? Like would a trimmed console app have this true or false by default?
Right. There's a few layers here. One is when you do like a Maui app or a Blazor WASM app, like you're trimmed in those cases, but you actually still want to use reflection in those cases because of the way they do trimming. They don't trim user code.
I see.
And they disable all the warning, or they hide all the warnings. And so like we don't want to break those scenarios because that's been working for multiple releases. So like for those, definitely reflection should still be enabled. If you're outside of those and just a console app, if you're publishing AOT, it kind of feels like this should be, reflection should be disabled because like it's not going to work. And it, like the way native AOT compiler works is even if you're using properties, it removes the metadata for properties. So your reflection doesn't work. And so I kind of think console app AOT, this should get turned off. This feature switch should get set to false. Console app trimmed, that I don't know about yet.
So how do we
It
do
feels
this
like
then? Because I mean, like a console app is basically just the base shared framework, the standard SDK, and the base TFM, right? So basically, if you want to say WinForms, WPF, and Maui, they all get a different behavior, then you would basically say the default behavior is as soon as you turn on AOT, it's turned off unless a more specialized TFM would override it and say, no, I still want reflection, right? Why am I looking at
that's how,
yeah, okay.
yeah, that's how we do it, is like we set what the base behavior is, and then for each of those app models, if they want something different from the base behavior, they override it for themselves.
Okay.
So
Makes sense.
the one that I'm up in the air about is just trimming, if we should set this feature switch or not. But for AOT, I think if you're published native AOT, this feature switch should be false for all app models.
Yeah, I think I like the default to be, as soon as you turn on trimming, we turn this thing off. And then maybe some more heavyweight app models override it to say, no, I still want reflection by default, because that kind of like, I like this more than the inverse, because it basically says the I guess the standard, the minimal core thing is to be, you know, as lean as possible, right?
Lean and also to work.
Yeah, I mean, well,
if you're using JSON reflection and trimming, like it might just work up until it doesn't.
yeah.
Right.
I mean, it's easy to be lean when not everything has to work, right? That's the
right.
If that's the baseline, then all right, then I guess we do this as approved and move on with life.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody context on this one here?
Hey, yes, I have context. So basically, first, let's start maybe with the motivation. So Michał has noticed that for many basic XML apps, like basically when you analyze the trimmed app, like we pull in the networking, and basically that is happening because XML by default is using XML URL resolvers in some places. So we've actually turned that behavior off, and then resolvers are mostly null across the XML, except for the root level, some of the root level APIs which take the URI as the input, in which case we will use XML URL resolver. So basically, and that thing is contributing like 3 megabytes into the final app. So basically, like the proposal here is to first introduce the feature switch very similar to the one we just talked about, but for XML, except with changes networking rather than reflection. So basically, yeah, like what this changes is basically, rather than using XML URL resolver by default, we would use file system resolver, and the file system resolver is also added in this API. So, and given those feature switch and this new API, like now in many cases where you actually even need to enable resolution, like say you have like a schema pulling in other schema, or I don't know, like for whatever reason you need to use DTD and you need to enable it. Like in this case, you also have the file system resolver, and you can also save those 3 megabytes if you use this. So, but basically, like the idea is like if you don't need to use the networking, like you will not have it, and like if you explicitly want to use it, you first still can use other APIs which take stream and other things, and you can explicitly set XML URL resolver, which will still pull that in. So like if you explicitly use it, you will be back to the place where you started with. So
I missed it. I think you said it, but I didn't quite follow. There had been a comment on one of the threads about how there's an existing API where in .NET Core it differs from .NET Framework, and if you set that, so we can't use that as the same kind of hook that Eric's used in the past to set a delegate, and you know that's what enables the trimming.
Theoretically, yes, but that would be really breaking, and many people would be not very happy with this. So
how would it be breaking?
So yes, so as I said, like the XML URL resolver is being used in 2 places. So like one is the root level APIs, and that is unconditionally currently. We always use XML URL resolver if you use the root level API, which uses input URI or similar. And but the default the allowed default resolver, what it changes is basically all of the places which do references. So when the input is like untrusted or something, and like it would, I don't know, like cause the web request or something, that would be blocked.
Let me try and paraphrase. You're saying the API that was mentioned is useful
Yes.
For when you construct an XML reader in some ways. By default, it doesn't have a built-in resolver, and you need to set it via that property. But when you do it in other ways, like via XML reader.create, it's always set. Is that a correct statement?
Correct. I mean, it's not exactly set. It's uses separate resolver for resolution of that specific
logically,
URI.
it behaves as if it was set. So it's not. So like you don't have to opt into it today, whereas you do when you use the other.
That resolution will only happen for the root level. For references, it will not happen. So that's why I'm saying there are 2 resolvers in place. So even if you use the API which uses input URI as so basically if you say xdocument.load and then you pass in the URL or something, like even if that URL inside has other references, that will not be used, because by default, so the main switch, the one we had before, that will basically block that. So like if whatever was under that URL had other references, that would be blocked.
So you're saying that the existing API that you need to set to a resolver only controls a subset of things that need resolution.
Subset, yes, the subset which basically has parses untrusted inputs. That's by definition. So like the root level APIs, because you pass the input URI explicitly, and the user basically says like they literally put the URL in there. Like we don't have control over that, and like we kind of try to make that work because we already made it work on full framework. So for the seems like quite a bit of people are using that, and because of that we made that still work on. So basically that thing will still use XML URL resolver, and in the and now the new switch allows you to change that default. So even if that allow default, or the old one, whatever it was called, the allow default resolver, like even if that is on, like the new switch will still change it, so it will use file system resolver.
So if our proposal here is to make this like you're opting into allowing resolution and it's off by default, that in and of itself is you said that we couldn't do it because it would be a breaking change, but could we just have that other property that we already have just apply to this case as well?
So I mean, you mean in this case completely not use resolver?
Like the proposal, if I understand it correctly, the proposal is by default, don't use a resolver for anything.
No, it will use resolver, but it will not resolve URLs. So the other thing is blocking resolvers completely. It will not resolve anything. It will not resolve files. It will not resolve anything. And this one is resolving files as well.
But
because that's the most common case. Where
files specified how? If file : / is a URL.
If you paste in the path into those APIs, the URI will parse it as the files scheme URI, and it will I believe, like if you do toString, it will tell you like the file : 3 / and whatever.
Right, but if I pass C : /foo into URI, that will also parse it.
Yes, I believe so.
So I'm trying to understand what does URL mean.
So yes, the URL like means like if you, for those APIs, like say do xdocument.load and then pass in the HTTPS whatever something XML, that will be parsed currently, like without this switch.
But
and after you will get the error, like if this switch is off. So like before any changes, like by default, if you do xdocument.load and then pass in the URL, that will be loaded, like from the web, basically.
What if I do that load?
And if you do .load, like, sorry, like I think I got a bit confused myself now. So again, so like before any changes, like if you do x document.load or other API and pass in the URL, that will work. Like with the switch enabled, that won't work, but anything with the file will continue to work.
When you say with the switch enabled,
the switch allows the URLs.
Right, but what do you expect the default case to be?
So depends on the if trimming is enabled or not. So like by default, generally, I suggest this to be true. So like when the regular reflection cases and we don't do any trimming, I suggest this to be true. For the trimming cases, I suggest this to be false. But like I am not super strongly opinionated on the regular case for that to be true still. Like I'm slightly afraid of turning that off because I think people will yell at me, and like I think it's.
Yeah, so many people using XML around the world, and I mean, like, this would be a big breaking change if we didn't consider it nicely. Yeah, I'm fine. I mean, like, with the trimming to enable this, but without the trimming, I don't think we need to enable this behavior.
I mean, it doesn't have to be defaulted to be set, right? Like it could just be an option that, oh, why is my thing so big? What are some strategies to make my apps smaller? Oh, here's one feature switch that can be set in your app. That doesn't seem so bad.
Like, honestly, I would go with the default for the trimming. Like by default, I would trim it out because like if you want your app to be slim, like you will definitely see this as an error. Like if you use the root level API and you pass in the URL, like you will immediately see the error. Like so user will know that we are not doing it, and then they will try to figure out what happened. But like we are not going to be adding.
Like, will you see the error? Like I tested it out with this XML file and this XML file. My app still works. Put it into production. Oh, now in real world, it's actually using URLs. In the schema.
I can make the error message tell you to enable that.
No, but Eric's point is it likely to get through testing?
I cannot definitely answer this question because like I don't know what people are actually passing. Like even if I get the numbers of how many people are using those APIs, and I'm not sure what the complete list is, like I won't be able to tell what strings they are passing. So I cannot reason about this.
Well, it's not even strings that they're passing, right? It's the payload of the XML file itself.
Right.
No, the payload doesn't matter because that will be blocked by default anyway. Like if that has references.
That's already the behavior?
Yeah. So basically, like currently, like if you load the payload with references or whatever which needs resolution, like that will be blocked by the other switch, which is false by default.
Only if I do like this. I thought there was certain APIs that were quote unquote safe.
Yes, no, only the root level resolution is claimed to be safe. So basically, if you pass in the URL to the XML API directly, that is like it's not safe. It's safe fish. Like it's like basically we trust that whatever you're doing is fine, right? Like I mean, I cannot reason if the URL is safe or not safe, but I can reason about the random URL in the untrusted payload.
So the only thing this switch impacts is a string that you pass, a string or a system.uri that you pass directly to one of the public create or equivalent methods in XML?
Correct. Like that's my understanding from the like all of the code pieces I looked at least. I think there was like 13 of them, and I looked at them, and that seemed to be the case. And like it definitely should be the case. And like even if it's not the case somewhere, that's because of the bug. Like that let me say it this way. Like the references, like any references coming from the XML, which is in the payload, should not be like resolved by default. That's because of the security guidelines we have. So only the root level, this can only legitimately that only affects the root level APIs. Like anything else would be like edge case we didn't find earlier. Like, I hope that makes sense.
But if the user is explicitly passing the XML resolver, I mean,
yes,
we will
yeah,
honor
like
that, right?
we will resolve that. Yes.
Okay.
Like if the user like passes in XML URL resolver for whatever, like we will use it.
Even with the string.
Yeah, that the only thing this affects is like if you didn't pass in the resolver, and for those root level APIs, frequently you cannot even pass that resolver. You would have to use different API most likely, because like for like an example for the X document, like to work around this, you would probably have to use like a stream API or something else which doesn't do web requests, which wouldn't be a URI definitely.
So if I just want to make sure I understand. So if this is false,
yep.
If this switch is false, and I do XML reader dot create HTTP:// my server / foo.xml, that's going to blow up with an exception.
Yes. I cannot remember if that
I think we skipped the DTT parsing at that time. We don't throw. This is what I remember, but I'm not sure. So
no,
if there is no result,
the DTD will not. The DTD will like if that URL contains like DTDs or other references, they will likely throw anyway. Like that will likely throw because like that should be disabled by default.
Yeah, at this point, I'm not even talking about the contents of the XML document. I'm talking about where the XML document lives. So if I say XML reader dot create, give and the string I give it is HTTP:// whatever. The intent of this switch is that setting it to false will cause that to simply fail.
Correct.
It's definitely going to break people if we turn it on.
Right.
I mean, if it's only public APIs, can we make new public APIs? Like read from file, load from file, or create from file, or something like that. Is it dumb to say that?
I mean, that was one of the things that had been originally suggested, that the problem was non-trivial amount of refactoring on internal implementation. But
I don't think that would be possible unless we sacrifice some async paths, like from my initial investigation, because there's some paths where we resolve the URL not immediately, we resolve it slightly later, like when you start reading basically, and at this point, like we basically it's kind of too late already.
Right, that's what I'm referring to, is all those places where we lazily do all the async work. We would need to refactor to not do it lazily and front load it as part of that XML reader.create from URL async or whatever.
That is potentially possible.
Wouldn't you just have to create a custom stream object to pass into the other thing, and that stream object can not fetch the URI until first read? Like, wouldn't that be an equivalent delay?
No, but the problem is the existing code paths route those.
Yeah,
like the existing code calls through to things like, that statically reference.
During the reading, there is like a state which basically tells you, do I need to do resolution now or something like that? And basically that is routing it. And
it's not that it's not possible, it's that it would require refactoring all of that.
Fair enough. So I can say, based on the description so far, the name of the setting you're proposing is not good, because it's not disabling URIs. You're saying, so it's not disabling URIs for system XML. It's disabling non-file URIs for the default resolver.
Correct. Like, so I initially thought of calling it something like that, but it seemed like too complicated.
Well, but that'd be like, default resolver supports only files.
Yeah, but like effectively for users, like that blocks URLs, and because there are really like files and URLs, and anything else is like almost no one uses that. Well, like FTP obviously yes, but like
Sure,
it
but
just,
if you're gonna
just felt like easier name to think about. Like
if a
but
URI, if you pass in a system.uri using the file scheme and that's supposed to still work, then this should really be system.xml.default resolver restricted to files, or default resolver restricted to file scheme or something. And that says what it does. It's the default resolver will only load things that say file :
yeah,
and
that's what. Yeah, like I couldn't think of better name. Like when I wrote this, this one sounds good to me. I don't feel particularly strong about it. I just couldn't think of anything better.
But is that even true that it would support file : // Like if I pass in a new URI with file : // that's going to work even if this is set to false?
No, because you cannot pass URI. You pass URI as string.
If I pass a string that is file : // that's still going to work even if this is false?
Yes.
We parse it ourselves?
Well, rooting system.uri wouldn't root the networking fetches.
The networking fetches come 100% from XML URL resolver.
So we construct the URI and then we check the scheme?
Yep, exactly. So I think there is some more logic. Like before we pass it to resolver, it does some checks if it's a path or something, and then does some magic, and then somehow ends up with the URI, and then goes to the resolver. I cannot remember exactly, but it's not just constructing and checking scheme, but eventually all it does is checks the scheme, and like after all of this magic happening, then basically I have a URI, I check the scheme, and like if it's a scheme is a file, then I do the file resolution, otherwise it throws. So basically that's exactly what the XML URL resolver except for the URL part.
So what I'm hearing is that you're always rooting URIs then. So like even if you set this to false.
No, the problem is with the networking, the URL. So basically, the XML URL resolver, when it sees non-file schemes, it does the web request essentially. It goes with the I forgot what the class was called, but that old one, not the one which takes credentials.
Yeah, so the trimming applies to the network.
Yeah. I think the answer to your question, Emo, is yes, URI is always rooted, but that is not the problem.
Yep.
Yeah, right. The problem is the networking stack, right? But URI wasn't small either, right? Didn't we factor this into a separate assembly because it's so large?
It's big, but it's not 3 megs big. I mean, it's big-ish.
Yeah, I guess the reason why I'm asking is like if we want to trim this, then whatever logic we have that depends on parsing URIs would be unfortunate, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would be very concerned if this being turned on means that we invent an alternate URI parser.
Yeah.
No. But I would be really, really large for me to even consider that.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if system.uri would be referenced and therefore rooted by something else already. But being able to take networking out of the picture seems
reasonable. Yeah.
I think where my head's at is for the interim, a switch seems fine as long as we're not explicitly setting it to false anywhere. If someone wants to opt into it being false, fine. But I think we'd break too much in a unintuitive manner if we, just because you enabled trimming, changed how XML reader.create behaved. And then in the fullness of time, if we could get rid of this switch by doing the relevant refactorings and exposing dedicated APIs that are, from file and allow none of the code paths that you access touching anything to do with it.
So I can do some investigation and see, like I can see if I can quickly do it. Like if I can, then I can send the alternative API. But like honestly, like the global
Looking at your sample app real quick, like if I was actually caring, if you can scroll down, Mo, if I was actually caring about, is it on here? Am I just seeing it on mine?
Might be on the PR.
Oh, I'm on the PR. Sorry. Yeah, it's 84169. Like if I really cared here, like all I would have to do is say xdocument.load new file stream, open quote.
Yeah, but like that would still root it though, like precisely because of the because of this like non-upfront loading of streams. It tries to use the async basically for those. So currently, like in order to use async loading for the web requests and the file streams, like it delays the loading of the file until the reading, and because of that, it can do the async.
Right, but if we had a load async rather than load, and it front-loaded all the work as part of the load async rather than as part of the lazily doing it the first time it's encountered.
That might help, but that's not the only API. There's quite a bit of APIs, which I'm not even sure what the list is, which would potentially need this. But like
are you sure new file stream would still brings in all of the web?
Yes, I've tried that actually.
I'm sure of it too.
Okay.
That was my initial response to the comments on the initial issue. I tried it, and it hits the same clip as it goes through the same choke points that basically say if need to delay load, access network.
Excuse me, did you just say when you say new file stream that somehow calls the networking stack from there?
Xdocument.load of new file stream.
Yeah.
It really doesn't matter like what like
it's
even
the same helper method.
Yeah, like basically like
see.
whatever does XML reading, there's a state in there saying like, am I resolving URL now or not? And basically that comes from the constructor, and because of that state, like we're always routing it. And I don't have a way of telling, hey, only trim this out if you use this API. Like, if there was a way to somehow tell it, like I would be able to potentially easily fix it. Otherwise, there's some trade-offs to.
And again, it's not about whether those code paths are executed. It's about whether they're statically reachable from the entry points.
Right.
That is the thing you mentioned earlier with like it's badly factored and it's not easy to refactor this in a way to make it linker friendly, right?
I don't know how hard it is to refactor. I just know that it's not easy.
Right.
Right. I mean, because the naive suggestion, having not looked at the code, would be if the version that you pass in a string and the version that you pass in a stream create different helper types and use internal polymorphism for one of them can reference the network and the other one can't, then the stream path would then never reference the type that would have talked about the network.
Right, but that also falls into the not easy.
That's a horrible amount of plumbing. Then
and a lot of this stuff is on the base type, of which there are 30,000 derived types in the XML hierarchy.
Jesus Christ. Okay.
I mean, 30,000 is exaggeration, but it's like 40 or something. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. Any number more than 4 is not great.
Yeah.
So then what do we want to do? Do we want to say like, do investigation to see whether we can plumb it, or are we saying, screw this, we just basically make it a public API problem?
My suggestion, and Christoph can tell me whether this is a bad idea, but my suggestion is we assume at the moment that this is the best we can do, and we add the switch to, put us in a state that we could ship. And concurrently with that, we investigate what it would take to not ship the switch.
Honestly, I think we should do both regardless. Like, that's my personal opinion, because I've been patching lots of bugs in XML because of bad resolver settings in the past. And I just feel like we are eventually going to be forced to have the switch anyway. It's just a matter of time. That's my kind of
You're saying you want
really strong gut. That's my
you're
really
saying
strong gut
regardless
feeling.
of trimming, you want a big security hammer that says disable all network access from XML.
Correct.
Then should that be what this is?
I'm thinking of both of this, but I do want to have a way of trimming without the switch as well. But the switch is definitely the easiest solution, and I feel like it's needed outside of the trimming context as well for certain scenarios.
So, I mean, based on the described impact of the switch, I put my suggestion of a name in chat, which is just so Emo could copy and paste it if you wanted, which is default URI resolver restricted to file scheme.
I mean, couldn't we just literally say, like, you know, I don't know, disable networking? Because that's kind of what it does, right? It's really about the URLs, right?
No, because if you explicitly use XML URL resolver, then you have it back.
Sure, but that sounds to me the same as the JSON one, right? Where it basically says something like, you know, is networking enabled by default, right? Or something like that.
Yeah. That's why we, like, I want to have at least default somewhere in the name that this is applying only to the default. Like, the rest I don't care that much, I guess.
I mean, then I suggest we literally use the exact same naming. Just replace, you know, JSON serializer dot is reflectionable by default would now be, I don't know, XML resolver dot is networking enabled by default or something.
That's fair too.
Because I mean, that seems like what we actually do, right? Otherwise, like, so what I don't like about the file scheme thing is that, like, is that really the only thing? Is there any other weird schemes that are still local, but we still would support them, but they're not file schemes, right? Like, at that point, you just talk, like, you're too specific almost, right? Versus the real thing is, we can parse any URLs, we just don't let you edit the next, we don't let you access the network.
I don't think it's going to allow HTTP localhost either, because in order to understand the HTTP-ness, it would need to ask the networking stack to go deal with that. So
yeah, that's why I said networking, right? Like anything that
sure
is opposed to saying non-local, right? Because that would imply localhost is supported, but
right.
Networking just means we never talk to the networking.
Yeah, I mean, if system XML is networking enabled by default, seems also like it describes the scenario here. If you explicitly use the URI resolver or URL resolver or whatever it's called, then
yeah,
like, you just said do networking. So
what Jeremy suggested is literally what it does, and like I like that name because it's not like extensively long, I guess. But it describes everything. But like I don't have a strong feelings on this.
I mean, I like the one I proposed, obviously, because I proposed it. No, like I like it because it's kind of what you would tell a person in the elevator, right? Like, you would not use the word file scheme in the elevator, right? You would tell them, like, yeah, you disable networking, right? That's what we really want to do, right?
Yeah, so as long as it's true, I think I like Emo's suggestion. If there's subtlety of other situations where networking would still be applicable without you doing a gesture that would bring it back in, then I think
not that
we shouldn't go for simple when it's false,
right?
But simple when it's true is good.
Then my only other question is, if we settled on that, should we model it after the other one as well and say there's a type name in between, like system.xml.xml resolver is networking enabled by default? Or are we saying no, it's just a switch and that's it?
That was my comment earlier in the JSON stuff, right, was think about where you'd put this public
API
property in the API, and then name the switch that, even if you don't put the public API in yet.
Then would we say XML resolver would be the place that we would put it?
I think it's XML reader, but
I would go settings probably, like as a static or if.
Yeah, I mean the problem with putting it on like XML reader is then you think it doesn't apply to X document.
Yeah, like I think the XML reader settings is probably the closest, but like X document has I think it has separate settings, or it doesn't. I can't remember anymore. I think there was the load something options. Or
It looks like it has its own load options type.
no, I think that's an enum actually.
Ah.
Yeah, that's an enum. So I think it gets it through the reader.
So via the XML reader.
Yeah. So yeah, the load options. I think it's just like a simple flag.
Yeah, I mean, so it could be put under XML reader. Just I think if somebody's calling xDocument.load of string, they may be surprised that a thing that was under XML reader applied to them because they didn't think they were using it. But I don't care. We can put a type name in the middle.
I mean, the reason I like this general pattern, right, is because if in 2 years we decide, well, we need to expose this switch because somebody's going to do something based off of it.
Honestly, like if we are gonna expose anything, I would do XML reader settings. No, wait. No, I was thinking to expose the XML resolver directly, but that's not gonna fly. Because not all of the APIs take the settings anyway. So
I mean, it's a static, right? So like, by and large, we can put it anywhere we want, right? So it just comes down to taste more than anything, right?
Yeah, but it's kind of, you know, the string is named different than the public API. It just feels, but it is a personal preference for sure. The string could be X, Y, Z.
No, I'm saying like I think I agree with you that we should match it so that the public API fully qualified name matches the string. I think that's the right thing to do. I'm just saying in terms of layering, because it's a static property, like we can put it on any type in XML we want, right? There really aren't any technical reasons why you would put it on, you know, XML reader over X document over, you know, that's just a taste thing more than anything. That's what I meant. Like any type is basically fine, right? Because it's a static, right? You don't have to plumb it through ever. I think honestly XML reader would make sense to me, the settings would make sense to me, the resolver would make sense to me. They all seem fine places to put it. I just say let's pick one.
yeah, my opinion settings.
I would vote for the resolver.
Yeah, fine. It's fine with me.
And the only reason why I proposed the resolver is because you already have it, you know, that's where you would put the actual instance of the thing, right? So that's why
fair.
It seemed like a good place.
I don't have any concerns with resolver.
All right. Jeremy, you were awfully silent, but I take that as don't care.
Yeah, resolver or the resolver settings or whatever, they all seem fine to me.
All right. Then, and we don't have public API right now, right?
Or what?
You're not exposing the Boolean through public API.
Yeah.
No, I didn't know that yet.
And we still say we do the investigation in parallel, right?
Yep.
And then I guess, so what's the default value then? The default value is still on, and it's not tied to the linker unlike the JSON one, right? So you literally have to set it somewhere if you want this behavior.
I would vote to make it enable, but like to trim out the networking by default for the trimming. But yeah.
That means the moment you enable trimming, your app behavior changes.
Yep.
I mean, that's true, but that's what we said for the JSON one, right? So I'm just wondering why we think that's
deserialize. and you didn't turn on the code gen, and now you have xdocument.load, and
But
you
for
passed in a
JSON,
networking thing, then
the reason they're a little bit different is because the JSON one's done for like actual functionality reasons, right? Like it can't work with
I guess
reflection.
the JSON
For
one
this
also was giving linker warnings. So if you said you wanted trimming, it was telling you like, either bad things are going to happen or I'm going to overhaul this. And this one is a functionality change that has no associated warnings.
I see.
Right. And also like this stuff works, right? It's just we're doing this for size, and Christoph's also doing it for a sort of a security concern, sort of, it sounded like.
Yeah, but a default of false only when trimming has nothing to do with security.
Right.
Yeah.
True.
That is
Agreed.
fair.
So that's why this one feels different, is because this one's strictly for size as opposed to functionality.
So do we have a sense for whether people, like how many people depend on this behavior? Because it does seem, like I never liked this XML behavior anyway, that it would magically hit the network for you. But do we have a sense for how much this actually impacts? Is this like 80% of people do this without knowing it, or is it like a super small percentage?
You cannot answer, unfortunately.
Anybody loading X document, right?
I mean, we do it in our own documentation.
Yeah,
We
like
show it fetching from a URL.
So definitely when I tried to block all the resolving, like my build failed because one of the things in XML which build was using files, but didn't use URLs. So I guess.
So is this only controlling effectively the root thing, or is it also if you have like inside of the XML document some weird URLs and they are not resolved? Is it just the indirect thing, or is it everything?
So, can you say again?
So like
Embedded URLs are not resolved by default.
Yep.
This
So
is
it's only about the
basically
root.
it's only about the thing you pass to load or any equivalent
I see.
entry point API.
But that was a breaking change we did to .NET Framework, right? On core, we basically said we don't resolve by default. On .NET Framework, I think we do, right? Wasn't that
Framework changed to like that's the whole DTDs got turned off by default and other things got turned off by default.
Right.
Yes,
the
first
That was
switch
a
was
security
literally.
thing.
Yeah. So I guess what I'm getting at is like, if we did that, then why wouldn't we do another breaking change, I don't know, in 8 or 9 and say like, we no longer do that by default either, right? So, unrelated to linking, but that seems
I support that if we make that decision 100%. So, but it's but like yeah, I if I had a good way to get the numbers, like how many people do that, like I guess the grep up is like I don't know how to 27 results is many comparing to
that's constant strings only, like literally someone colon HTTP, not a string that was initialized to a URL earlier. I expect that number's way higher.
Yeah, but like they would also have to have trimming enabled, right, for those scenarios.
Well, that's if we tie it to trimming. And I think I'm convinced this setting should never be tied to trimming.
I think that's fair. I think that would be odd, right? Because it's like I completely buy the argument that in JSON it made sense because it would have never worked anyway, so we might as well do that. Versus here, it's a completely orthogonal thing. It's just that if you want to trim, sure, you might want to have it smaller, but now you take about functionality takebacks that you have to opt into. I think that's fair. I think the question is just should we turn this off by default anyway, right? And then if
I think that's
a different
to
thing.
Eric's point, like it makes sense to link to trimming things where when you turn on trimming, it will then break.
Right. Yes.
That is not this.
Yes.
Right.
It will work if you're willing to pay 3 megabytes.
Because really the only time you're going to pay 4 megabytes from turning this feature on is if you weren't yourself already doing things with networking. So now you're saying you're an application doing XML that never would have issued a web request of any kind. And that exists, but I don't think it's going to be super duper mainstream enough that saying that we were going to trim this out by default would be helping more people than it hurt. So I don't think that we would have justification of changing the default of this setting unless,
yeah, I agree.
Screaming at us.
I would really like to change that, but I agree we don't have a good enough justification.
So this would just go on to a page of documentation for things you can try to make your trimmed app even smaller.
It's a good point that Jeremy raising here about like how likely like any application is not going to access the network in general.
Yeah, that's
that is using XML.
Yeah,
I mean, if you're writing a tool that you're trying to make really small and it's just doing input-output manipulation of some data, like totally reasonable, you might not be accessing the network. And from a sample perspective, if we're trying to say, oh, look how small you can make these, and you're trying to manipulate some XML, then like, okay. I think in a more robust shipping application, it's a whole lot less likely.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I don't think it's non-existent. Like you could write an XML pretty printer and just like, here, take files I have on disk and go pretty print them. That one you wouldn't be doing anything with URIs ever. You would just open the file with the reader, write it back out with the writer with pretty printing turned on, and ta-da. And then you would see if you cared about getting that as trimmed and minimized, because then you'd have the settings of here are things you can turn on to make your app even smaller. Note, some of these may come with functionality breaks. Please test.
I mean, it does seem, I mean, what Steven said is not unreasonable, right? Like we have optimized for convenience. I think it's just super weird if you think about it, right? Because, you know, take everything else we have, let's say a JSON document that has a load method that takes a path, right? For the most part, you don't really expect that to work with random network URLs, right? It's just that when we designed XML, it was this Webby technology that we all believe would connect arbitrary things over the wire, right? And I think we have largely walked away from that vision. So at this point, it just seems like an odd kind of like artifact of the past that you can actually use networking URLs in strings that are normally just paths. And it's only the case in XML. It doesn't work with files. It doesn't work with, you know, JSON. It doesn't work with, I mean, most things that take paths really.
Well,
right?
Oh, I guess that's actually an interesting point of why networking is a lie. Is if you give a UNC path, it'll still resolve it because FileStream can open those. So
yeah, UNC
it's not
is a bit tricky. That's fair.
It's not saying you don't leave. It's not saying that the network is never involved. It's that we didn't use system.net. But
yeah, like technically on Linux, you could open the TCP file, right? Like which opens the what was.
But that's kind of like, yeah, I would say that's an OS abstraction, right? That you can basically mount network devices as paths, right? But as an inside of .NET, it just seems super weird to say, you know, oh, we just support arbitrary URLs here, right?
I think it would be less weird if XML followed the framework design guideline that says if you're taking a string something URI that you should have an overload next to it that took a URI, and then it would be like, well, obviously this is doing a URI fetch, and you'd be like, that means it probably supports all sorts of protocols. But the fact that they just took string, and they may have called it URI, but I agree this is unique to XML. But I think we would be breaking more people than we would be helping by turning it to off by default.
I mean, that's basically, I think, the thing we should think about. But yeah, it's not tied to this. I would agree with that. I think it just comes down to the general gist of how we think about the stack, right? I mean, because we're basically saying because of this feature, everybody pays who does trimming by default, right? So it kind of comes down to like, are we willing to say that? And that I think is something that may change over time, right? If trimming becomes more popular and more people are writing robust apps, maybe at that point it just becomes an oddity of the past that is just worth breaking with. But we don't have to tie these two things together. So then I guess we approve this one here and then we move on.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh boy.
So we jump from not wanting people to use the network to making it easier for people to use the network. Basically, the motivation here is, if you're doing anything robust with HTTP client, you're using HTTP client factory in your web app, or you're creating, an HTTP client that's configured in a variety of different ways to optimize for this or that. But if you're just writing a little tool and you just want to grab some data, we've basically forced you to say new HTTP client, and then you find all the documentation that says you need to, put this in a using, or dispose of it at appropriate times, or have a singleton or whatever. So the idea is basically, let's just make those easy cases easy by having a singleton that if you all you need are the defaults and you just want to say, get string async or get stream async or whatever, you just say HTTP client.shared.blah. And it certainly won't work for everyone. I mean, it'll work, but it won't, it won't be configured exactly the way that they need. But for you just doing something simple, you're grabbing something from the web.
Right.
This makes it easy.
Client search, you can't use this. If you want to handle redirects yourself, you can't use this.
Right. And so we could say
that you can do better than sockets handler, you can't use this. But
exactly. So we could say that maybe having, I think there's value to this, but to play devil's advocate with myself, like you could say there are too many things that you need to configure. So this isn't the 90% case. This is the 20% case. And so let's not confuse things further. That would be a reasonable argument against this. That said, I still think we should have it.
So wasn't there some discussion of like when you excessively create HTTP clients, that's also bad, right? Isn't that true too?
Yeah, you want to have as few as possible, because each HTTP client instance has its own connection pool. So basically, you want to have, well, more specifically, each socket's HTTP handler has its own connection pool. HTTP client is a thin wrapper around any handler. It's really just a helper class. So that logic around have as few HTTP clients as possible. If you look at something like HTTP client factory, it creates a new HTTP client basically on every request, but it's wrapping a shared handler that is under the covers. It's managing the lifetime of. So you want as few connection pools as possible. And this would basically be one connection pool associated with this shared instance. We'd have the option of ramping up how aggressive this shared instance is at, tearing down its pooled connections. So while the default might be X, we could say that, while the default for how long a connection sticks around might be 2 minutes, we could say this guy's connections stick around for, 20 seconds or something.
Right.
But that would all be policy underneath the shared instance.
I don't remember if sockets handler or the system default handler defaults to having things like krill checking turned on. I think that if we add this, it needs to be the secure option. Otherwise, it's just going to go on the internal use ban list straight away.
Does HTTP client go on the internal, like new HTTP client? Is that on the ban list?
Yes.
Really?
You're not allowed to say new HTTP client paren. You have to create it with the handler and turn krill revocation on if you're a Microsoft product.
We do that in our own uses?
I'll leave that up to Levi because he's the one who generally gets stuck with enforcement, but the rules are you have to.
It's complicated. I'll mention in chat. Things are in flight right now.
But in general, we should be designing this such that it's not just for one-liner applications, that it's a good default for people to use. And
I have no problem with that statement, as long as we didn't end up configuring it in a way that made it even less useful to people.
Fair enough.
So then functionally, like, is it fair to say the shared instance will give me the same handler as the default constructor would have?
That was my initial proposal. If we do what Jeremy said, that is not the case. We would be applying different policy to the shared instance.
Yeah, I guess to me, if the only policy differences are from the result that this thing sticks around for the lifetime of the application, so you want a different timeout or whatever for the pool reuse, I think that's fine. It's more like for functionality that, I don't know, the socket handler can reach certain things that the other handler can't, and now I get like functionally very different outcomes whether I use, client.shared versus new HTTP client. Like, does that make sense? I mean, there's some sort of like grow up path, right? You want to control the instancing more, so you move it into a type. Well, if now suddenly everything, something unrelated also disappears, that would be problematic.
Yeah, I mean, the only one that I know of that are that Microsoft guidelines for using .NET for HTTP say to change the default is to turn on certificate revocation checking, which is not on by default.
Yeah, those are the kind of things I'm thinking of, right? Because that has nothing to do with the handler sticks around for the lifetime of the app, right?
Right. And I mean, we could also, depending on, Steve said maybe it will change the connection pool settings. We could also say that it uses different timeouts than the default timeouts. So we feel that for reasons we can't change the 60-second timeout, but we really think that we would have loved to change the default to be like a 2-second timeout because it's 2023. Like, this could have different policy. I think it would be good if it told people what the policy was, but aside from like looking at source.net, but the but yeah, anyway, I think it's good, and I think it'll make things easy to use, but I want to make sure that we're not just setting ourselves up for another thing to add on the internal audit list of nobody's allowed to call this, because if we're adding something that even we ourselves aren't allowed to call, then the more we do that, I think the more disservice we're doing to our customers.
Maybe, but we have different criteria for ourselves that we don't necessarily need to enforce on the world. And B, we're not following our own guidance in many places. So I'm not sure what it means.
I also don't think it's us versus them, right? It's more about what are you building, right? If I build a console app that I run once, I don't care, right? Like and I'm at Microsoft, right? So I can use it, right? But because we don't ship my console app, right? But I think it's similar to, let's say, datetime.now, right? We would say when you build a service, don't use datetime.now. I'd use TimeProvider, right? But that's not to say that you should never use datetime.now. If all you do is just print the current time in your console app to compute how long it took you to run it, like, that seems fine.
Sure, but in this case, my understanding, and I could be wrong because I don't pay as much attention in networking, is our defaults to URL fetching has revocation checking off by default because IE had it off by default in 1998. At some point, computers got fast enough that they decided that revocation checking should be on by default, but .NET has this, like, we never change behaviors. So even though the OS changed their default behaviors and all the browsers changed their default behaviors, .NET stayed behind with, in 1998, this was too slow to do. And we're 25 years past that.
Well, now apparently we use a browser to render a chat box, right? So
yeah, so that means your chat boxes are by default doing revocation checking. But if you wrote it with .NET, it would not be, which would save you 0 seconds.
So I'm a bit confused where we are now, because for me, it makes sense to say this is a usability API. If you just throw out some code, you might still get actually better results. And if you build robust code, you want to think about this more. You may have additional either analyzers or just generally like code quality rules that prevent you from using this. But that's, I don't know, that to me is not any different from, let's say, random.shared or datetime.now or any other static helpers we have, right? It just depends on what kind of app are you building, and is this something you need to worry about?
That's fair.
I mean, we also have, this is brand new. We have the ability to configure out however we think it makes sense. I think it's straight. I have an easier time understanding it if it matches the exact same observable behavior as the HTTP client's parameter list constructor.
Right.
But it doesn't require that. And I don't think that changes the shape of this in any way.
Right.
We could change the shape, excuse me, by giving it, say, a setter. And then you could shove whatever thing you wanted in there if you wanted to publish it for the rest of your app to use. We can also do that later if we found that to be valuable, or we could have it pick up some data from configuration somewhere if we found that to be valuable. But I was really going here was just a really simple, I'm writing a simple tool and I just want to make a web request.
Right.
Yeah, I think the API itself totally makes sense. And then I'll just say work with Barry and Levi on the policy, because if it uses the default policy, then they need to tell the code scanning people to add this to the ban list.
I did see a comment scroll by in the chat about, or a question about, what does it mean for the settable properties on HTTP client? So on HTTP client, all of the settable properties throw exceptions once the initial request, once at least one request has been made. This would basically pretend that a request has been made. So basically all the mutable properties would throw exceptions.
Yeah, that makes
seal
sense.
itself as part of assignment into the field.
Yeah.
I think that makes sense. I don't think we should have this behavior that we would allow the setter until you make a request, right? So we would always say you can never set anything on this on the shared instance.
I concur.
On that note, also we would make it so that HTTP client.disposed is a no-op when used on this instance.
That sounds friendly.
Yeah, but to the point that was being made earlier, I don't think that our internal requirements. I agree with what Steve was saying. I don't think our internal requirements are fatal to this proposal. We might want to add a switch in the future that makes it easier to fulfill our internal requirements, but I really don't want to force those on end users.
Fair enough. I mean, I'd like to suggest that we change the defaults and turn revocation checking on by default, but this is not the place to do that. So
there are a lot of people who would agree with you on that, and I have been herding cats over the past few weeks regarding this.
I mean, with regards to this proposal, like if we turn revocation checking on by default everywhere, then this would obviously go along with that. But as someone said, this is not the place to make that decision.
Right. Anyway, I assume you'll be tracking this as one of the things that you have to deal with, Levi. So.
I'm already in all of the different meetings that have been tracking this for a while.
I just mean, if we don't change defaults or change the policy here, then this needs to go on the scan list. So.
Yes. Yeah.
All right.
So do my comments here reflect what we concluded, or did I forget something?
Maybe
Seems
the
good.
dispose issues that Stephen mentioned need to be written.
Yeah.
So what was the issue?
Dispose on the shared instance will be a no-op.
Yeah.
Yeah, chat is asking, should it instead or also be a sockets handler.shared?
I wouldn't do it instead. It could be an addition.
Yeah, I think in terms of usability, like people expect to be able to use HTTP client, not the handler directly, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is really intended as the super simple thing that, you know, little apps can use to just grab some data from the web. The moment you get into handlers, I think you step off of that easy path. It would enable you to do things like, use the shared connection pool, but change the timeout associated with the requests that you're making. I mean, which, it's certainly something someone might want to do, but at that point, like all this is helping is you not having to write private static read only HTTP client equals new HTTP client. So it really is this super simple path.
Right. And over time, anybody, or if you're using a dozen different libraries that have that same pattern, now they get to all use the same one. So, but yeah, I think it's goodness. Just my concern was the CodeQL.
Yeah, I've been involved for the past few months with the team doing CodeQL on this, and I can make messages go back and forth as needed.
So then I guess we concluded that we approve it, and then we see how this goes, right? That was the conclusion, right?
Yes.
Yeah, approving the shape, and Levi may have some fallout.
Yep. Alrighty, back to networking. Anybody context on this?
This was basically add some more name status codes to our enum, or one more name status code to our enum. And the networking team's discussion of it later was basically, this sounds like a fine value to add.
Why did we not have this earlier? Is it a new status code, or is it just nobody asked for this yet?
I think it's newer / somewhat unofficial, but official enough that it shows up in, or it was a newer HTTP, a newer RFC. I don't remember exactly, but it wasn't initially around.
Oh, I see. So is it just an alias then? Because it kind of sounds like it's an alias for something that already exists, but under a different name.
I don't think it's an alias. I don't think we have one with the same value.
We do. We have unprocessable
entity.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
fine. That's interesting. It's an alias. I see. You're right.
Yeah, that's what this stuff here seemed to suggest. That's why I was curious. I mean, that seems reasonable. I mean, we have done this before, apparently.
Yeah, if it was the first time we did it, I'd probably push back a little bit and say, like, you're taking something that where every value is unique and now it's not. But
yeah,
the only thing this is, gonna break is if someone was doing toString or something and somehow it ended up resolving to the other one.
Yeah, presumably that's order dependent, right? If we add the member after the existing one, we keep the current toString behavior, right?
Yeah, not quite, because the enum code does like a binary search in some cases and a linear scan in other cases.
I see.
So, yeah.
Oh, well.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah, I think Chad has reminded me to ask, don't we actually have all the HTTP codes in like 6 different enums?
I don't think so. I'm pretty sure I've always used this one.
Doesn't ASP.NET have its own? I thought doesn't really matter here, but
I mean, I totally believe we have it like sometimes as an enum, sometimes as an int, but I don't think we had multiple enums.
Yeah, it looks like ASP.NET has a type hierarchy of I status code HTTP results that they may care about, but that's not the enum.
No, that's the whole action result thing, right? That's just you create an action result with a value. I think that's what it means. Yeah. And that's an int again. So, I mean, unless somebody knows where it is, I would say.
I've just tried searching for a few of the value names, and this is the only enum I find that contains those names. But
so there's a status.
Yeah, I'm not seeing other not found fields. I thought we had it redundantly repeated for reasons, but I'm not seeing it.
Oh, I see it now. So there is a Microsoft ASP.NET.HTTP status codes. That's a class. But that one is the old ASP.NET, I believe, right? I don't think there's a new one for this.
no, there's a new one.
There's a new
Microsoft ASP.NET Core.HTTP status codes, but it's all ints, public constants. It's not an enum.
Well, but logically the same thing, right? But they're all prefixed with the status code, right? So it literally says status 226 I'm used, right? Or status 301 move permanently. So I don't know. Like that seems like I don't think we have. Do we have any of the other overloads here? I don't think we do, right? No, like 301 only occurs once. 300 only occurs once. So none of them are overloaded. And there already is a 422 and it says the old string. So I think it's fine. So I would say the existing one we just don't update because the other ones are also not in there.
Cool.
Actually, no, I already copy pasted it here. All right, then good for this one. I think this is also Stevens, right?
yes, or sure. I'm paging it back in. If I remember correctly, TextWriter, the base class, only has a FlushAsync that doesn't take a cancellation token. This is about adding an overload that does.
What's it gonna do?
The base implementation will check the token. If it's canceled, return a cancel task, and otherwise delegate to the existing flush async that doesn't take a cancellation token.
So it can have been pre-canceled and it'll abort on that, but once you pass the precondition, it's unabortable.
Right, but then all of our implementations will override it.
Sure.
All the
I mean, I think that's the best we can do, but just making sure that we had a plan of what the implementation was.
Yeah, and the so just to confirm here, the object is dead if the cancellation token triggers, right? Because like you don't know the state of the flush or not, and
right.
And once flush async, once the task completes, either successfully or not, the object is safe to dispose. Correct.
Correct.
Okay.
Safe to dispose. You mean?
Yeah, safe to dispose.
Yeah.
Because it's dead, so you can't do anything aside from call dispose, right?
Yeah, I mean, a given derived type could choose to do something more robust, but that's the general base behavior. Is you can't, for both streams and text readers and writers, you can't trust anything about the state of the object after one of the operations has been canceled.
Sounds good.
Other than cleaning up, you can dispose.
Remind me, are there any cases where our sync APIs take a cancellation token?
Where the synchronous ones do?
Yeah.
Very few. Some of our synchronization primitives do, like wait methods that take a cancellation token on semaphore slim and maybe some blocking collection and a couple others. And I think maybe when we added to HTTP client and the handlers the ability to have a kind of a very slim synchronous path through it, I think maybe we included the cancellation token there, but it's definitely the minority.
So it wouldn't make sense here for flush?
I mean, if we did it for flush, we'd also need to do it for read and write and all the other operations. The synchronous ones don't take cancellation tokens.
Right.
For the most part, because things like flush tend to call non-cancelable like IO, taking the cancellation token wouldn't really help. It would just kind of pollute the public surface.
Yeah, because a lot of times this is just wrapping a stream or something, and the synchronous methods there don't take cancellation tokens, so it wouldn't help a whole lot unless it was a much more complete, across the board.
Then I guess that is it.
We're cruising.
We are. So
go, 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 go.
So we have a few more. Is Tarek still on the call? Do you want to talk about this one, Tarek?
Yes, sure. Okay. Yeah, as you know that we exposed TimeProvider as a time abstractions a couple of weeks ago, and yeah, I mean, like we got many users, I mean, like trying it and sending some good feedback from the community, which is a good thing. I mean, like we got a quick response here. Basically about like the current way we exposed it, it was abstract class, of course, and with abstract methods and abstract properties. And the scenarios that users run into it about like somebody wants just like to override just one functionality, not everything. I mean, like UTC now, and they found like, you know, it's not intuitive to be required to override all methods on the class just to get the functionalities that they need. I mean, so this is one thing. I mean, like if I want to override UTC now, I mean, like I should be able to override just one method, not every method inside the class. The second thing is like we had a protected constructor that it takes the frequency, I mean time frequency. And this is actually, I mean, like, you know, if again about like the same scenario, if somebody want to override like UTC now only, I mean, like why they need to provide like, you know, the time frequency at that time. So this is the two feedbacks. I mean, the third one is regarding the properties. I mean, we had UTC now as a property, we had local now as a property, and we got the ask to change those to the methods. It's for a couple of reasons. I mean, like one of them is like they said this. I mean, like our design guidelines saying like we shouldn't throw from the properties, but they have some scenarios that they can throw. I mean, like while you are calling like UTC now. One example of that about like if somebody writing like a time provider for networking. I mean, like. So maybe they got something and they need to throw when something fails here. And they prefer to have a method at that time. Yeah, other thing is like our design guidelines also mentioning about like, if you have like the value changing every time that you call the property, it's better to have a method instead of properties.
Right.
Yeah, but so basically about like, you know, this proposal is addressing these three feedbacks about like, if somebody need to provide just one thing, they should be able to do that. And the way that we addressing this, we changing the abstract methods and properties to be virtual. I mean, so, and we will provide the default implementation for every one of them, and the default implementation will match whatever the system behavior, I mean, we have. And second one is the protected constructor that it takes frequency. We removed that, and we made the timestamp frequency to be virtual. So, and we provided the protected constructor, which is parameterless constructor. So anyone want to override just one thing, they don't need to care about like time frequency at the time. And if somebody cares about time frequency, they can just override it through the virtual property. And third thing in this change is we are changing the UTC now, local now properties to be just a methods. Yeah. So this is basically mostly is a change we are proposing here in TimeProvider. Any question, any feedback?
So the description said that the base implementations of all of these would fall to the system defaults, correct?
Yes.
So are there any of these that really have to be changed together as a pair? Nothing occurs to me, but I wondered if something occurred to you.
Just the timestamp and the timestamp frequency.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yes.
Maybe when I had to run off, this came up, but Steve, I thought you liked the idea of the timestamp frequency core so that it wasn't going to do a virtual get. Do you not care anymore?
So there's the whack or listed on that line. So I don't have a strong pair between them. There's pros and cons depending from a perf perspective. There's pros and cons for each. I would do whatever we think is cleaner. And from a cleanliness perspective, there's something very nice about just having a virtual, just like the rest of them. And we just document like, hey, this value should never change. There's also something nice about guaranteeing that it will never change. So I could go either way. We definitely saw feedback though. People, especially in the camp of those holding on tight to the interfaces idea and the mocking stuff, really disliked the notion of protected things to be mocked. But yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
I think it's 6 and 1/2 dozen of another.
Fair enough. I mean, I like the idea of it protecting itself against nonsense, but don't care enough. So
I mean, to some extent, like, you know, if you look at the proposal that we had for the fake one would have methods like advanced time or something like this, right? Which normally you would consider as nonsense, right? But when you then consider how these types are being used, you pass it to something, and then while this other thing is running, you don't get to change your frequency, right? But in a mocking scenario, it might make sense to test basically with this frequency and then that other frequency, and it might be easier to just say, I have one type.
You mean one instance, just for ease?
Yeah, and then you just have a method that just changes the field and you know.
I mean, we would basically document that it, and that makes total sense, Emo. Just from an ease of testing perspective, I think I can't think of any situation where in production it would make sense to change your frequency, because it means you can no longer relate timestamps. You have no idea what they mean. But for testing purposes, if you want to, you know, set it and then run a test and then set it and run another test, like I can see that being valid. In which case we would just go with the simple public virtual.
Right.
Yeah, and do we expect that we're only going to have one inbox implementation?
We expect we'll only have the system implementation in CoreLib, we expect that in one of our Microsoft extensions libraries, we'll have a manual fake, whatever you want to call it, implementation where you can manually advance the time.
I see. The reason I ask is if most applications would only ever reference in their entire set the default implementation, doesn't that mean all of this would get devirtualized?
Yeah, by PGO, we would expect, by dynamic PGO, I'd expect that this will invariably get devirtualized.
Okay.
But without dynamic PGO, it wouldn't, because you're not just saying TimeProvider.system.blah, in which case it would get devirtualized by default.
Right.
You're injecting with DI the time provider to use.
Right.
Yeah, of course.
So the only other question I have is, so it makes sense that UTC now and all these things are methods. Do we, like, how much do we care? Because you're effectively fighting, like, I don't know, 20 years of these being properties. Arguably there should have never been properties in the first place, but that's what we shipped in V1. Do we care about this discrepancy, or?
This is the feedback we getting for many years now about having those as a properties. and yeah, I mean, like, the community members, I mean, like, they saying like it's time to fix it at least. I mean, it doesn't mean like, we need to keep the consistency with something that really was not good to expose in the first place. Yeah. Also in the chat, I'm seeing a question about, like, we removed from local time zone method, and we doing that because, like, right now we are exposing, time zone info, time zone property, it's virtual, so anybody can override it and can achieve the same scenario. So we don't have to have a factory method specifically for this.
But
in the
old
primary
system,
with primary constructors, it becomes 4 lines, 2 of which are braces to implement the same thing yourself. So it's if you care about that scenario, which I believe is a corner case, you can easily achieve it.
But wasn't the original idea you could say TimeProvider.system from local time zone? Now you can no longer say that, right?
No, it was, you could say TimeProvider.from local time zone. The reason that was useful as a static, the reason that was useful was you had a bunch of abstract methods you had to override, and so it made that particular use case a little bit more challenging. Now with the system implementation being in the base and everything being virtual, you only have to override that single virtual to return the time zone. So it becomes trivial to, if that's what you need, it becomes trivial to write your own implementation.
Yeah, I guess my question is, we don't want to provide, so I would say, like, I thought last time when we discussed this, we basically concluded that the only people that should ever have to subclass this are people that want to do something like mocking or testing, right? Like, normal users who just want to plumb things through would only ever effectively interact with the system provided one, right? Which now means this is an example where, I don't care about testability. I just want to have, the time that represents a certain time zone. I no longer have a method. I now have to subclass.
Well, the from local time zone was an example of the 1% case where someone wants something other than system, and we were just providing a static method for that very niche use case. And the argument is, we don't need to provide that static method if you really have that derive and override.
And can you remind me how somebody gets the system provider instance?
TimeProvider.system.
Yeah, there's a property. It's like
it's a static property.
This guy here.
Okay, that's good, because if we were making a system time provider class that was public, then we could just give it another constructor, which is what time zone should it use as local.
I mean,
but
that's another. We could choose to make, like, at this point, there's nothing abstract left on the class. We could choose to make the class non-abstract, and then you could instantiate it, and you would be getting something with equivalent behavior to system. You'd just be allocating to do it. My argument about leaving it abstract is simply there's no benefit to instantiating the base type, so let's help people realize that they shouldn't.
Right.
But we could change that.
No, I think I agree with that. I think, to me, the time zone one, I'm not entirely sure that I fully understand. I think our or general mechanism. Like last time I had to do this, it was basically between client and server, where I wanted on my server to have the time zone of the client. So I wanted the system time, yes, but I did want to have it adjusted to the client's time zone, right? But, you know, I don't know like whether that's a real scenario or not, but I would say if it is a real scenario, I think we should probably have a static method for this and not tell people, oh, now you're going to derive this thing, right? If that makes sense. Like if you think that's a real scenario for production apps.
In your scenario, were you just trying to do a time zone conversion, or were you actually like trying to pass the equivalent of a time provider?
I mean, in my
because
case,
there are APIs for time zone conversion.
Yeah, so in my case, I don't have a time provider, right? In my case, I just deal with literally like datetime offset instances, right? And so I adjusted those at some point and said, okay, this is the client's representation. So when you render stuff out, I want this to look like that the client would expect it to be, right? Which I think, I mean, again, maybe that doesn't apply here because this is a different mechanism, right? But yeah, I think like just from a design standpoint, I think I like the idea that people that don't have to do testing don't have to derive, I guess is my point, right? But if we say like, well, even in that world, like you would never have to change the time provider, you would just get the system time via the time provider, and then you just adjust the time zone that this guy gives you, right? That's fine, right?
I think it's not no one will ever need to. It's that the 99% case is you just use TimeProvider.system. And my argument for removing from local time zone is that falls into the 1%.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable thing.
That said, like,
sorry, go ahead.
I just want to say, if we really think it's bigger than that, if we really think it's a much more common thing, we can provide the API. I'm just trying to avoid. I want the 99% case to go to use .system. I don't want them to look time provider dot and say like, oh, I guess I should call from local time zone with time zone info .local. That's what I want, which is not what they want.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. I wonder if maybe something that could make this better is if we just like create really good usage documentation for this, showing a complete end-to-end scenario. Because Amo, you said that you had a need to convert a daytime offset between different time zones. There is an API for that. However, it might not. People might not know where that API is. So if we had a full end-to-end example as part of the docs for this class, maybe we could help steer people toward the right place.
Yeah, using the time zone info conversion APIs, it will not be good for testing. I mean, like if somebody want to test with other scenarios, I mean, like, and they don't have to depend on that. So this is why we have the abstractions in first place. I mean, like to allow people to test their stuff with the time. So manually doing the conversion will disallow them to do the abstraction.
Well, I guess that depends on how you do that, right? I mean, I think you could argue that the time provider is really a way to give you the current time, right? And then you could argue that the client's time zone is just additional data, right? So imagine you have a system that takes a constructor that takes both a time provider and the client's time zone. At that point, it's still fully testable, right? You're basically just saying that, you know, certain cases where I ask for the current time, I want this to be on server time, and in the other case, I want this to be on the client time zone. So, you know, I convert in my code as needed, right? Because what's client, what's server is not really something I test, right? That's kind of like implicit to the way I do business. It's just that what I abstract is the current time. So I think I'm okay with saying this thing doesn't solve that. It just gives you the current time. And, you know, you need to know when you want to do a conversion. You need to know what the target time zone is. But that's almost like orthogonal state, right? I think, you know, it just intuitively would make sense to me to say, yeah, you get the current time, you know, change it afterwards if you want to, or you don't, depending on what you do. So I guess I'm kind of with Steven, like, let's keep it small for now and then just see what scenarios we have.
Yeah, okay, sounds good.
And then, so is it fair to say, like, for now, we don't do the protected virtual, we just go with what's here, public virtual long time stamp frequency? I think I personally would prefer that because it's easier. And slightly cleaner.
Okay.
Right, so nobody said anything else, so I guess I post a comment. And then we're at time. And we have finished all the blocking issues except for command line, which is on for Thursday. And yeah, more 8.0 issues popped up apparently. Then I see the rest of you on Thursday and some of you on Tuesday.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.